Welcome to the Grow Your Independent Consulting Business podcast. I'm Melisa Lieberman, a fellow IC and business coach. On this podcast, I teach you to become a consistently booked independent consultant without becoming a pushy salesperson or working 24/7. If I can do it, you can too. Listen on to find out how. Welcome to episode 147 of the Grow Your Independent Consulting Business podcast. I am Melisa Lieberman, and I'm really excited that you're here today. If you're listening in the real time, it is officially 2024. I'm recording this at the end of December 2023, but it will go live in the new year. It's such an exciting time, I think, to be able to think about and just reimagine, take a step back and thinking about what you want to achieve in your business and why you want to achieve that, and visualizing what it might look like to have that next version of you and your business. I don't know about you, but it's been such an exciting last couple of weeks to just have that space to think a little bit more. I know I advocate so often on this podcast that it's important to carve out that business owner thinking time on a regular basis, not just at the end of the year. But certainly the end of the year makes it a lot easier because there are typically fewer meetings, fewer client deliverables, and just more space to be able to think about things. So I hope you've been able to leverage this time not only to recharge your batteries, but also to really do some high quality thinking about what you want in your business in the coming 12 months and what that might look like and why it might make a difference for you to have achieved it. I know that's how I've been spending my time. I've actually been spending my time thinking and planning and just giving myself that space, and then also watching a bunch of movies because it's kind of cold here in Colorado, and then also working on my book edits. So lots of edits that I've been working on, and we're starting to get closer to the go live date. I think it's January 25th, whatever that Thursday is. I've already lost track of it, but it's really close now, and so I've just been spending a lot of time on those edits as well. Hopefully, you've been having a good break as well, just really thinking about your business and what you want to achieve in the coming year. So, with that, let's talk about an interesting topic, I think, that a lot of us face from time to time. And sometimes you don't want to deal with it. And sometimes we feel like we've done something wrong when we get ourselves into this situation. And that's a situation where you're starting to consider whether or not to fire a consulting client. This is actually quite a common situation. And I want to share with you today a framework that you can leverage to decide whether or not, when, and if to fire a consulting client. So I'm going to dive right into the agenda. Then I'll share with you a companion resource, and then we'll get into the heart of it. So, from an agenda perspective, when to fire a consulting client. Have you ever think back to a time you may be in this situation right now, kind of dreading getting back into, especially if you've taken time off for the holiday and you're kind of dreading getting back into your client work because the client is frustrating you for whatever reason, and you're questioning whether you've just kind of hit your limit with this client and is it time to fire them. I want to walk you through an example of this, and as a way to illustrate a process of how you can decide whether or not it is time to fire a client, and how to make the most of this situation for both you and your business, because it can be an incredible asset. I know it's frustrating and not a situation you want to be in, but it can be an incredible asset for you in your business if you treat it in that way. So that's what we're going to work on today. The agenda is first, we're going to talk about the situation that you might get yourself into when you're starting to think about when to fire a consulting client. I'll just describe it so you may relate to it in some or form or fashion. Then we'll talk about the difference between a clear-cut reason to fire a client and the gray area. And then, like I said, I'll talk with you about a very specific example to illustrate the process that you can leverage to decide when to fire a consulting client. And then stay tuned to the end, because I'll pull it all together for you into very specific next steps for you to put into action in your business. Whether you're facing this right now and you can use this tool in the real time, or whether it's something that you want to get ahead of and be more proactive about in case you do get into this situation in the future. Regardless of which of those two buckets you're in, this is an important episode because oftentimes it's easiest to deal with this situation when we're not in the middle of it. So, if you're in the place right now where you're not having this problem, where you're not considering firing a consulting client, or maybe you don't have a client at the moment, then this is a great episode to work on from a proactive perspective to put the tools in place for your business so that it becomes a lot easier to deal with when you get yourself into this situation, which happens to the best of us. So, before we dive into the first step of the agenda, I want to share the companion resource with you for today's episode. And that is my Coaching for Consultants program, my coaching program. I work with independent consultants, helping them to grow their businesses and scale their businesses so they make more money, enjoy their businesses, feel more fulfilled, have more work life balance, and take on work that is impactful and meaningful. So, if you'd like to learn more about coaching for consultants, you can go to the website iCyourway.com. So, the two initials IC for independent consultants, yourway.com. And we'll put the link to that in the show notes as well. Okay, so let's talk about the situation. Like I said, you may have been in this situation before, whether you were in corporate life or as an independent consultant. And if you haven't, I can almost guarantee that at some point you're going to get into this situation. So, when we're at a point in our relationship with a client where we start thinking about, is this worth it or not? It can range from, something on the lighter on one end of the equation, like feeling underutilized or underappreciated or unappreciated, all the way over to feeling like you're in a aggressive situation, a toxic situation, a situation where someone or several people are sabotaging you and making it difficult for you to produce the results that your client is looking for. And then on the very far end of the spectrum, maybe they're not paying you. So you're doing work and they're not paying you. So those are some of the situations that we get ourselves into as consultants where the client isn't what we thought it might be. And we start to question whether or not it makes sense to continue working for this given client. So, with that in mind, the question then becomes, when do you fire this quote unquote bad client? One way I like to look at this and what I'll share with you today to consider is really thinking about this in two ways. Number one, there are some clear cut reasons to fire a client, very clear cut reasons. Those are very few, though. Very little falls into that category. An example might be they are not following the contract. For example, they haven't paid you. Very clear cut, right? There's no subjectivity. They didn't pay you, haven't paid you. They're telling you maybe that they don't have the funds to pay you. And it's not just a matter of sort of things getting stuck in the accounts payable department. It's a question about whether they have the ability or interest in paying you. That may be a situation that's very clear cut for you. And you get to decide what that is. For some consultants, they keep working for, various reasons, whether it's because they want a certain relationship or they want equity or they want to be able to negotiate for equity, whatever the case may be. It doesn't mean that just because someone's not paying you that you should definitely fire them. But what it does mean is there are circumstances where it can be very clear cut for you to say, you know what, this makes sense for me to fire this client. And you get to decide that criteria. So I would recommend for you to start with here in today's episode and the framework that I'm sharing with you is to really decide what those policies and protocols are. At what point are you going to say, this is a situation that I'm in that means that I'm going to fire the client, no matter what, such as they haven't paid for, they're 45 days past the due date, something like that. As I just mentioned, very little typically falls into this bucket. Most of the things that you might encounter or will encounter fall into the subjective, into the gray area. And that's really where I want to focus today's episode on. where it's not a clear cut decision about whether you should fire the client or not. There's pros and cons to firing the client, and you're really on the fence about whether or not it makes sense to keep going with the client or to part ways. And so I'm going to share with you that story, that example, as a way to illustrate the process that you can leverage in order to figure out when or if to fire a consulting client. So, this example is actually a personal example from my years as a full time consultant. I don't know how long ago this was, maybe 8 or 9 years ago now, but I think you may relate to some or even all of this situation that I'll share with you now. And like I said, I'm going to walk you through this scenario so that you can hear the example and also so that you can understand the framework that I use to figure out what to do about this situation. And then at the end, I'll bring it together and share with you at a high level what those steps are so you can go put it into place in your business. So here's the example. I had a client, in looking at the client on, if I were just to give you all this situation and tell you all the details, which are really unnecessary at this point for the purposes of this podcast. But if I were to tell you every last detail about it, I think we might both agree that it was a toxic situation. By most standards, we could say that this was a toxic situation that I was in with this particular client. There was a lot of infighting in this organization, a lot of political backstabbing going on, a lot of maneuvering happening, people saying and agreeing with you in meetings and then going behind your back and either changing their minds without acknowledging there was a change or purposefully going about undoing any decisions that had been made as a group. So I'll call that undermining and blatant sabotaging. There was a lot of pointing the finger at me because I was an external resource, and that was even, easier to point the finger at in some cases, in some ways. And also, I felt like I just wasn't making any progress. There was so much time being spent on all of these problems, personality conflicts and relationship issues, so much time being spent on those conflicts, and so little time being spent on achieving the goals that we had set forth to achieve. And it felt to me so frustrating. And I was just becoming increasingly miserable, dreading every day when I woke up thinking about working on this client and, the work that we had ahead of us and how much I was just spinning my wheels. And I got to the point where I just wasn't sure if how much longer I could take it. It was super frustrating. I can't even describe it now, but it was creating such a burnout for me and so much second guessing about my capabilities and whether or not I even knew what I was doing. Was it this client situation or was it just my overall ability? Maybe I didn't have the skills to hack it as a consultant. So it was starting to make me doubt my ability overall, not just for this client. It was a very bad situation. And I started thinking to myself, life is short and I'm an independent consultant for a reason. I want to pick and choose who I work with. If I wanted to kind of be put in a group of people like, that I didn't choose, I would be a full time employee. And I'm not. I'm an independent consultant for a reason. And so all of this just got me into this state of questioning what I was doing and why not just fire the client to make everyone's life easier because it wasn't worth it. I was at a place mentally where I just wanted to work with clients that I liked, who valued my contributions, where it didn't feel so difficult and hard and kind of a repeat of some of the issues that happened in corporate, before I left. And so that's where I was at. And I was on the verge of firing this client, but I decided to pause for a moment and just really pick this apart. And so I worked with my own coach on this, who at the time asked me two really helpful questions. And we'll put these questions in the show note along with the overall step by step here. And the first question that she asked me was, why did I think I was being so impacted by the client's behavior? Why was it bothering me so much? Why was it feeling so incredibly frustrating? Why was I just dreading every moment with this client. And I could have easily justified all that to her, chalking it up to, it's wrong for people to behave in the way that they are behaving. They're aggressive, they're toxic, and making it really clear that this was just people behaving badly. And that on the surface, we could probably agree to this. It's fairly accurate what was going on. But the truth also was that I was insecure, that I had a lot of self confidence issues. And so all of this internal politicking and the internal relationships amongst my stakeholders and the relationship I had with the stakeholders, all of it was contributing to and making my insecurities grow. I was allowing it to make my insecurities grow. If the client didn't automatically listen to me or take my advice or seem appreciative or seem really excited about what I had to suggest to them or to recommend to them, then I blamed them, saying, this is an impossible situation, versus looking in the mirror and saying, I've got some growth here in terms of my influencing skills. So that was the first thing that my coach asked me is why. I'll use the word triggered. Why was this situation so triggering for me? Why was I so impacted by this client's behavior? This is a common situation that we've all experienced likely in some form or fashion, internal politics and people not following through with what they agreed to, people changing their mind. All of those things are very common in the workplace. And this was, I will say to you very clearly, this was another level of that kind of an environment. But at the same time, the question is so helpful to understand why, given this situation, did it impact me so much? And like I said, that helped me to uncover a lot of the insecurities that were just under the surface that I hadn't really recognized or understood were there completely. And then the second question that she asked me that also really getting to the root of this situation was a question that made me very angry at first. Made me very angry. And I'll tell you what the question was, which was she asked me, how are you 100% responsible for this situation? Now, that is very infuriating, I have to say, because it wasn't my fault that, or how would I be to blame for this type of behavior and this type of culture and this type of toxicity that was seemingly okay or in some ways even encouraged? I didn't feel like I was to blame for other people's bad behavior or this culture. But after I took a pause and she helped me to see the spirit of the question, which was this is not about who's to blame. This is a question that can be really helpful to answer for yourself. In this case, for myself, if I'm 100% responsible for the situation, for the changing of their mind, for the lack of follow through, for the fighting, for the lack of direction, for the lack of progress. Looking at the whole picture and saying, if I'm 100% responsible for this situation, or how could I be 100% responsible for this situation? And when I started looking at the question from that perspective, that this was a question meant to help me, the answers meant to help me, not to blame me. The truth of it was that I uncovered in this situation was that more and more and more, I was avoiding the client because I didn't think they found value in my work or my advice. And I was making this situation and taking it very personally. And with each passing day, as I grew more and more frustrated, I wasn't looking for solutions and I wasn't looking for alternative paths. I was looking for people and things and culture to blame for the situation. And that's what I was responsible for. I can't control other people's behavior, and neither can you. But at the end of the day, we can control the way we show up and the way our skill sets to be able to navigate through some of these fairly common situations when we're engaging with clients. And so after I recognized some of my own gaps and some of my own ways that I'd contributed to the problem, then we were able to start working on the solution to this situation, which again, going back to the point of the episode, was the question, should I fire this client or not? And When I got to the place where I said, you know what? I realized that there are two things here. There are other people and their behavior and their choices. And then there is what I can control, the way I'm showing up, the way I'm thinking, the way I'm engaging. I wanted to leverage this as an opportunity to improve those skills. What better opportunity, what better environment, what better situation to leverage than one that is, you know, quote unquote toxic to grow these skills even and build these skills in some cases that were missing or in some cases that had, opportunity to improve. So what I did was I worked with my coach. We worked together on three specific next steps, again, related to whether or not to fire this consulting client. The first thing I did, and I would recommend to you also, is that I made a decision. I made a decision, and I'm not saying you should stay with the client or not stay with the client. You've got to decide for yourself, but it's important to decide. Staying on the fence, constantly second guessing whether you should stay, whether you shouldn't, taking every meeting that you're in or every interaction that you're in as input into this continued question about should I fire the client or not is not valuable for you or for the client. So in this case, I decided I was going to stay on the contract for 90 days and then make a decision about next steps. And by deciding, that means cutting off the other options. In that case, it meant I'm not going to go back and forth anymore for 90 days. I'm not going to second guess. I'm not going to take the next interaction and get back into anger and redecide. I made a clear cut decision that I committed to that I was going to stay for 90 days no matter what. So that was the first step. The second step was that I cleaned up my thoughts about my client to neutralize the emotion that I was experiencing. Again, I took control over what I had control over. And one of those biggest areas was the way that I was thinking about the client. When I was thinking about the client, things like, the stakeholder, the main sponsor, he's aggressive, he doesn't value my contribution. Of course, I'm going to show up in a defensive way or even avoid him entirely when I'm thinking that way. So I shifted purposefully my thinking to something more simple yet believable, which in that case was it's possible this isn't about me. I created an emotional state of more curiosity or neutrality than frustration and failing by simply shifting that thought process rather than waking up every morning and thinking, I can't stand working with this person. He's toxic or he's too aggressive or he doesn't think that I'm adding value. I would redirect that thinking over to it's possible this isn't about me. That lightened it up. That made it so much easier to feel neutral about the situation, feel curious about the situation, to be able to engage with him without feeling defensive. And the other main thought process that I shifted was about the company itself, about that client company. My main thought up to that point had been this is a toxic environment. This culture is, a train wreck. This is not a good place for anyone to work, let alone me who gets to choose who my clients are. None of that was helpful thinking because, again, when I had such a negative, unproductive thought process, I could give you a lot of evidence to prove to you how toxic this was. And you would likely agree with me if I, going into all the details. But that's really not helpful. That's not helpful to me. It wasn't helpful to me. And it wasn't helpful to me to show up as the most impactful consultant to that client when I was thinking about them and their culture as toxic. And so I shifted that from this is a toxic environment, which, by the way, that thought process in and of itself also lends to that confirmation bias that we've talked about on this podcast before, right? When you're thinking this is a toxic environment, then you're constantly looking for evidence to prove yourself right, which I was doing. I was constantly looking to say, oh, look, it is a toxic environment. It's not my fault this isn't going well. It's a toxic environment. And so I shifted that thinking over to this is a learning opportunity. doesn't matter if it's toxic or not. I didn't even argue with myself about whether it was toxic or not, or try to talk myself out of it, or shift into some positive thinking mantra. That's not the objective here. What I did do though is just shift it into a space, a thought process of this is a learning opportunity, which then made it feel so much more neutral, made it feel so much more light, and also got me into that kind of almost curiosity zone again, which is such a great go to emotion. Just feeling curious about, okay, I wonder what technique I could try to be able to get some consensus and have people stick to the consensus, like true buy in. And so that was the second step, is that I cleaned up my thoughts about the client so I could neutralize that emotion that I was feeling, that anger and that frustration and that just feeling at my wits end, and shifting that over through my thought process to more curiosity and neutrality. And then thirdly, once my emotions were lower, I was able to increase my ability to reason and problem solve and get creative. As they say, when emotions are high, logic is low. The opposite is true too. When emotions are lower, such as curiosity or feeling curious or feeling neutral, then it unlocks that your ability to reason. And that's what I did for myself by shifting my thought process and just no longer accepting of myself thoughts that were not productive, such as this is toxic or they're aggressive or they don't value me, over to it's possible it isn't about me. This is another learning opportunity, and creating that neutral emotion, that curious emotion. That's when I was able to unlock this third step, unlock the ability to problem solve, unlock the ability to test out different approaches and get creative. And what I ended up doing is figuring out, really identifying the most supportive person on the client project team and re-emphasizing the importance of building and nurturing that relationship with that person, and leveraging them as a sounding board to figure out, okay, how do we get more traction here? How do we get people to buy into the vision here and then also not change their mind later? Or not tell us that they buy in and then do something else after the meeting is over, all of those kinds of things. So, leveraging this internal resource and building and investing in that relationship, and using that relationship as a sounding board and a back channel, and to my benefit and also to the benefit of the project overall and to the person that I had built the relationship with. It was a win-win-win in that way. I stopped making things personal. Once my emotions were lower, I stopped. No one else changed their behavior, by the way. None of this required or was relying on anyone to stop behaving in a quote unquote toxic way. This was about me taking responsibility of how could I engage in a different way as a test to figure out how to get a different result. I stopped taking it personally. I started asking myself the question, thinking about who did I think would be able to navigate this situation? Who did I know from my past interaction, my past professional relationships? Who do I think might be able to navigate this situation I was facing, in a really powerful, productive way? And it was one of my past bosses, mentors. And so I'd ask myself the question, what would he do? It created a degree of separation in this case. So it wasn't about me. It was about taking me out of the equation and really thinking about what might the approaches and mechanisms be to move the project forward. And look, I wasn't perfect at this either. There were a lot of times where I would get back into the zone of frustration or even starting to verge onto, second guessing and wanting to fire the client. It doesn't require perfection, but it does require, and what I would do is just redirect. I would say to myself, I decided to do this for the next 90 days. And so I understand that I'm feeling frustrated right now. And what can I do to just take that temperature down again? Redirecting to keep the emotions low in order to create a space for problem solving. And so ultimately, the results of this situation, I'll share with you here, and then I'll wrap this up with the framework to put this into action for you when you're deciding if you want to fire a consulting client or not. The result here is that at the end of the 90-day commitment, we had completed the project. We had moved the project forward and got it into the space, ultimately across the goal line. It was a solid result. I will not kid you. It was not a stellar result. It was not the best project I've ever, been part of, but we were able to complete the project rather than letting it get sucked down, delayed, iced indefinitely by all of these interpersonal conflicts and issues that were constantly arising. So in this case, the example that I shared with you today is that I decided not to fire the client, and I decided to leverage this opportunity as a way to uncover and work on my growth areas. I will say that I also chose not to pursue any follow on work with this client. So that put a bow around it and I moved on. I stayed for what I had committed to with the client, and I stayed for me and building my own skill set and investing in my own consulting capabilities. And I had so much growth as it related to influencing what you could call difficult clients. And from all of this experience, I also identified even more criteria that I was able to add to my sales qualification process to help avoid these kinds of situations in the future. Now, again, I personally don't believe it's possible to 100% avoid challenging, difficult, toxic, whatever word you want to use, clients. But at the same time, improving that qualification process up front can definitely help to minimize those kind of scenarios. So, as we wrap up today, what I shared with you here is not a you should always stay and never fire the clients type of advice. But what it is really two things, two mechanisms for you to put in place in your business. The first is number one, predetermining your protocols and policies. What will be the clear cut reasons that you will fire a client? Write it down now. Write it down now before you're in this situation. That's when you have the greatest ability to reason because your emotions are not on fire. Add whatever this criteria is to your sales process so that you can better qualify clients and identify potential issues up front and know that you're not going to work with clients that might not be the most productive to work with. You want to decide ahead of time. So again, it's not that emotional decision coming into play. So you can write that down for yourself. If a client falls into these certain categories, I'm going to refer them to someone else, or I'm just not going to pursue that type of business. Or if they get through the filter and these certain things are in place, I'm going to fire the client, such as they haven't paid me and it's 45 days late, whatever the number is. So the first part of this process for you to decide when to fire a client is to predetermine those policies and protocols so that you're not having to decide in the moment. And then you're going to be left with a lot of gray areas. You're going to be left with a lot of gray areas like I just described to you. I would personally never write down that I'm going to fire every client that's toxic or every client that's indecisive or doesn't follow through with decisions that were being made. You may end up firing all the clients if that were the case, right? So when it's a gray area, here are the steps that I recommend taking. And it follows with that example I gave you. Number one, make a decision. Decide what you're going to do. Are you going to stay or are you going to fire the client? Decide to fire the client, like your reasons. Reasons that you can own up to and live with versus trying to escape a difficult situation and thinking that things will be better next time because oftentimes they're really not. So number one, decide what you're going to do about this situation. Then number two, commit to your decision for that specific time frame. The example I gave you was 90 days. And during that time frame, you're not going to second guess. If you do second guess, you're just redirecting yourself. I promised myself that I was committed to this for the next 90 days. That's it. And then next, you want to explore some of the questions that I shared with you that my coach asked me. And also, I'll give you a few more, and we'll put all these in the show notes. Why is the client's behavior impacting you so much? How are you 100% responsible for the situation? What can you gain from staying? What thoughts do you need to neutralize or shift so you can lower the emotional temperature and turn the frustration into a more productive emotion like curiosity? And then finally, you want to fold the learnings back into your business, testing out new techniques to get buy in, testing out new techniques to work with difficult people, testing out new techniques and adding them to your tool belt of approaches that you can leverage time and time again across all of your clients. And folding back the learnings into your sales process so that you may have more qualification criteria, more boilerplate language in your contract template, more proactive touch points or milestones or checkpoints in your process to ask yourself before things get so far down the road that it feels almost unrecoverable. Those are the kinds of things that you want to fold the learnings back into your business so that you make the most of this situation. It's not about just sticking it out to deliver what you promised to the client. Certainly, that's part of it. If you're going to stay, you want to be able to deliver what the client needs. But at the same time, turn that into an investment for you and your business so that if you decide not to fire the client, you end up getting a good return on the time and emotional labor that you put into that particular client. All right. So that's what I have for you this week: when to fire a consulting client, and putting in that mechanism in place in your business can make it so much more enjoyable and fulfilling and less frustrating and challenging to manage these types of clients. All right. Thank you for joining in, and I will see you again next week. Take care. Thanks for joining me this week on the Grow Your Independent Consulting Business podcast. If you liked today's episode, I have 3 quick next steps for you. First, click subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to make sure you don't miss future episodes. Next, leave me a review in your podcast app so other independent consultants can find and benefit too. And finally, to put the ideas from today's episode into action, head over to melissalieberman.com for the show notes and more resources to help you grow your consulting practice from your first few projects into a full-fledged business. See you next week.